Test. Oh yeah, looks like I'm good. Okay. I'm Phil Wyman, and this is the Wild Theology Podcast, where the world, the humans in it, and God are all wilder than we've been told.
That's your intro?
So, you'll get philosophy and theology and crazy stories that come from 30 years of pastoring.
Boring.
20 years of festival work.
Whatever.
And the mud and blood of wrestling with the living in spaces angels fear to tread.
Ooh, trying to sound interesting, are we?
Oh.
Yeah, you think you got something to say?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the problem, dimwit.
Look, I'm a lot smarter than you think.
Yeah, you tightened your shoes this morning.
Whatever. We're Phil Wyman, and this is Wild Theology, where you get to argue with your own ideas.
And lose.
That's the point. If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Phil Wyman. This section of Love Bigger Go Home, Part 7, is entitled Go Local. And so here I'll be discussing what that means to go into all the world and preach the gospel, particularly when staying at home. These two things are not independent of one another. One can go while staying. So the little city where I've been a pastor had been pastor for almost 20 years, Salem, Massachusetts, it swells in population during the tourist season. Most of those visitors tend to be day travelers. They catch the train from Boston, drive in from nearby locations, or occasionally drop in on a cruise ship. These visitors come from near and far. They're French-speaking Quebecois, European tourists stopping in as part of a longer vacation in America, Chinese students and families visiting to discover the famous history of Salem's trade with China, history buffs from around the U.S., the seasonal leaf peepers, and of course, neo-pagans of various tribes making their own sort of pilgrimage. The world comes to Salem, Massachusetts. It's one of those places where the nomadic impulse in people is tickled from afar and they come to scratch that itch. It offers history dating back to just 6 years after the landing of the Mayflower in Plymouth, Mass. And it's a sensory overload of beauty with its architecture across almost 400 years and the autumnal explosion for which New England is so famous. It's also a spiritual destination, and this might be its most powerful draw to the traveler. When we scratch our nomadic itch, many of us are drawn, like the ancient nomads, to places of spiritual interest. In our minds, these are magical places, and they tug at our heart. The Muslim is drawn to Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. The Jew is drawn to Israel, and especially to Jerusalem. The Christian is drawn to Rome, the pilgrimage of St. James to Santiago de Compostela, and like the Jew and the Muslim, to Jerusalem as well. The Hindu to Varanasi, the Mormon to Salt Lake City, or the Hill Cumorah outside Palmyra, New York. Salem is one of these places. The famous witch trials of 1692 and 1693 left an indelible mark on the town, and then again in the 1970s during the rise and revival of pagan witchcraft practices and beliefs, and their corresponding interest in ancestry and ethnic background. That mark was indelibly imprinted on the town again. Consequently, neo-pagans and witches from around the world come to visit Salem as a type of mecca for the witch. Even Christian missionaries find interest in the little old New England city because it's home of America's first Protestant missionary to set sail to other lands. Adoniram Judson left port from Salem on February 19, 1812. What this means for those of us living in Salem is that, like people in other destinations of interest, once we step outside the door of our house, we just might run into the whole world. This can be a hassle during the tourist season. The traffic swells and comes to a crawl on the narrow New England streets. The lines are long in the stores and the restaurants are filled to capacity. But for the missionally minded Christian, there is another way to look at this situation. It's not a hindrance to living life the way we want. It's an opportunity to live life the way we should. Once we step outside our doors, we have the possibility of reaching the world. When the gospel reaches into the hearts and our hearts and cries, "Go," we can go without going anyplace. Unfortunately, there are few destination locations where the local Christians see themselves as greeters to the world and potential influencers of cultural change. In fact, like most gospel sharing, it tends to be relegated to a few crazy people preaching aggressively on the streets. 15 to 20 years back, it was popular in pastor circles on the North Shore of Boston to talk about the need to be gatekeepers of the city. Of course, Salem was a primary focus for this kind of talk because it is the North Shore's most famous regional location, and at one time in its history, most of the surrounding towns were part of Salem proper. The theological framework for gatekeeping was based upon Old Testament passages about men of good reputation who were given duties to sit at city gates. Of course, this has a defensive element to it. They were able to watch for trouble and guard the city or the temple. David assigned 212 gatekeepers for the tabernacle, and Nehemiah assigned gatekeepers to protect Jerusalem once the wall was rebuilt. In Proverbs 31, we read about the husband of the virtuous woman, who was respected and sat at the city gate with the elders. Now, I have a few friends who live inside an old walled town in Carnarvon, Wales. But there are few people today who have the benefit of living alongside a castle. So our position of defending the city walls is viewed as a spiritual position for those who promote this teaching. They say that we are defenders of the presence of God, just as the gatekeepers were positioned in front of the tabernacle of David and the temple of Solomon. Thus, we are called to keep bad things out of our lives and out of the church. Gatekeepers are people who protect the church from heretical and or negative spiritual influences. First century Jerusalem had the same approach to protecting the faith from corruption, and understandably so. Centuries of persecution and oppression at the hands of Greek and Roman conquerors left the nation and its faith in disarray. The Pharisees were a sect of Jewish religious leaders who cared for the condition of the religion among the common people. Judaism, as you know today, would not exist without their positive influence upon it. Yet, when Jesus arrived, he challenged the scribes and Pharisees concerning the manner in which they were trying to attain their goals. Hear this quote, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those who enter who are trying to." Jesus, that's Matthew 23:13. Jesus clearly saw an unfortunate religious legalism occurring in the Pharisaical tradition during his time. He challenged it and called for grace and mercy to be exhibited toward the people the religion was meant to serve. I have seen this same religious hypocrisy today. It's rising up in circles of pastors who are sometimes calling for us to be gatekeepers. The same pastor I mentioned in the last episode of Love Big or Go Home castigated me for speaking in a Catholic church or being engaged with the Halloween crowds each October, was the foremost proponent of this gatekeeper theology in Salem. Have we become like the religious hypocrites Jesus rebuked? Since we are citizens of another kingdom and we, quote, look for a city whose builder and maker is God, unquote, perhaps our gatekeeping should model something Jesus might have been proud of. Maybe instead of being protectors and defenders, we should be greeters and hosts. Maybe our best use of resources is to be inviters and includers into the kingdom of God. When 1 million people come to my little city, I want the opportunity to be a greeter to the city and to set the tone for a positive experience. But my greeting is not just a welcome to my city, it is an opportunity to establish a good reputation for the Christians who live within it, and as an extension, a good reputation for Christianity as a whole. While our church and our friends were serving hot cocoa on the streets and greeting visitors from out of town, and some of the so-called gatekeepers were gathering in their churches and praying against the tide of evil they imagined descending upon our city. They sought to keep people out, while we sought to invite people in. And I can't help but wonder which approach Jesus might have honored and which approach he might have rebuked. You might be living in a destination location, and you might be in a place where you can be a greeter for the whole world. And, as a consequence, also be somebody who influences people to think of Christianity in a positive way. Thank you to my patrons who help make these missional travels and these podcasts possible. Without you, I couldn't do it. God bless you. If you'd like to support this project, you can do so here on Patreon for as little as $1 a release. And at the most, that's $4 a month.
Why on earth would anybody want to support us?
Well, I think we're pretty cool, and maybe some people believe in what we're doing.
Oh, come on, you believe that?
Yeah.
Don't you ever think you're just a little too weird for the average person?
Yeah, sometimes.